Hello, this DCS tutorial will cover the landing of the P-51 Mustang. Landing the P-51 is one of its most difficult challenges. Hopefully this tutorial will give you what you need to get the most out of your practice. So let's get started with our landing tutorial for the P-51 with the basic visual approach method. Now you can learn to land in many different approaches, but this is a good one to fall back on if you're learning how to do it. First, what you want to do is obviously contact the ATC of the airport that you're flying towards. Let them know you're inbound. There we go. Now we'll request landing since we're apparently close enough to be able to.
Request landing. Chevy 1-1, Tacoma, clear to land, runway 30, wind 306 at 3 meters per second.
Now as you notice, they'll give you the direction of the wind. If the wind is going along with the runway, you want to fly the upwind leg of your visual approach method, which is flying against the wind. Whenever you're flying against the wind in your approach method, what you want to do is fly over the airport at about 1,000 feet in the direction that you will be landing. You want to use this time to decrease your manifold pressure to around 30 and put your RPM at about 2,700. You want to decrease your speed below 200 miles an hour, but as you can see, my speed... What? Okay, the runway is not occupied. I don't know what the ATC is talking about, but my airspeed is currently too high. That's what this turn that's coming up is for. Right now, once you pass the runway, you want to turn left or right, it really doesn't matter, and turn around and follow the runway back at a good distance, and you want to use this turn to bleed off some of your excess speed. My goal right now is to get my speed below 200 miles an hour. And right about here is where I want it. Alright, now I'm going to start flying back in the direction I came from. Now that my speed is well below 200 and closer to 150, I want to lower my flaps. If you use the lever, you want to lower it about a third of the way down, or maybe a little less. If you're using the F key, you want to press it twice. Now you want to increase any of your throttle as necessary to keep your speed at about 150. And right now, once your speed is below 170, you want to lower your landing gear. As you probably noticed when taking off or doing other things with your landing gear, the light turns red down there whenever it's in the process of lowering or raising the landing gear, and it turns green once it's done. Now you want to keep following this path, following the runway well out here, well past the end of it. Now I'll take this opportunity to talk about once we land what we do. Once we're on our final approach and we're about to land on the airport, we want to do what's called a three-point landing. Now this doesn't always work, and it takes a lot of practice. but your goal is to essentially be stalling out your plane just a couple of feet above the runway, keeping the plane's wheels level to the runway to try to minimize however much bouncing you'll have, and to have a smoother and safer landing. So once you're having to turn your head all the way back to see the runway, and it's about past your tail out there from your point of view, you want to start turning around and cutting the 1,000 feet of altitude you have about in half. Now you want to lower your flaps all the way. Just press F 3 times or lower your flap lever all the way. Now I'm a little bit off, but this is nothing to fear. If you've done it correctly, you should have plenty of room to line your plane up with the runway. I'm going to work on lining myself up. I want to give myself a good amount of altitude. Instead of explaining the angles of landing and things like that, it's really best just to see what it looks like. Knowing what you're doing just from experience or from watching a video like this will help you a lot with landing. Now once I'm lined up with the runway, I'm going to start bringing my nose straight with it. My landing gear is down. Now, as I'm approaching the airport at about this distance, I want to start trying to get my speed to go closer to 120 miles per hour. And my goal is to, whenever I actually land, have my speed at around 90 miles an hour. However, if it goes too low, I could stall at this altitude, and that would destroy me. Try to keep the plane level as you can. It's about 120. Now I want to cut the throttle back all the way, pull up. I had a little bit of a bounce there. That's alright. Now I did have quite a bit of a bounce there, but as far as landings go, it's not too bad. Your goal is to eliminate that bounce, however. Once you get really good at landing, you'll be able to start to do that every now and then, and once you master it, which I haven't entirely, you'll be able to eliminate that bounce. That wasn't a very high bounce, but if you bounce higher than that, you want to be very careful. Bouncing too high can sometimes cause you to damage your airplane on the next bounce. Now in case of landing too fast, you want to open your canopy. I have read that this actually increases your drag and will act as a small air brake. If you're needing to brake at high speeds using your wheel brakes, you want to do the same thing you do when taxiing and pulse your brakes, pulling back on the stick. Pulling back on the stick is a good idea once you're rolling down the runway anyway, because it will keep your tail wheel locked and help prevent spinouts. Landing at night is, to be honest, not much different than landing in the day. While the runway is harder to see, the lights at the end and on the sides of the runway make it pretty easy to make out. The important things to remember are to turn on your navigation lights for other planes to be able to see you, and to make sure that your landing gear spotlight is on. It usually is on with your landing gear, but in case it's not, you can use this switch right here. Using that spotlight allows you to be able to tell your distance to the runway once you're right over it a little bit better to help you make a softer landing. It's important to remember that you should be flying a little bit lower the faster you're going, and a little bit higher the slower you're going. Try to prevent stalls and to try to prevent too harsh of a landing. I'm coming in a little fast here, so I want to get a little bit lower. Coming in pretty well. Need to aim for 120. I'm going to cut my engine power all the way back. You really don't need to worry that much about hitting the very end of the runway, but a little bit better that time. These runways have a lot a lot of extra room because they're made for modern jets. Now you want to carefully use your rudder to keep yourself on the runway in case you start to drift to the right, like I'm doing, or to the left. Now I can open my canopy to slow myself down. Now let's go over landing in a crosswind. Landing in a crosswind is very aggravating and has taken me a very long time just to be able to do every now and then. The key to landing in a crosswind is not to use your visual approach method, but to come in straight from a distance so that you can do your trim correctly and line yourself up. As you can see, the engine wants to go straight, whereas the rest of the plane wants to go to the right. That's because the crosswind is going from the left of the runway, in this particular case, to the right. What I've done is used my rudder trim to compensate for this by turning my rudder trim to the left. This does not mean that your nose will line up with the runway, but it does mean that you will stop moving to the right as much. Your goal is to keep your plane from shifting out of line with the runway. However, once you're en route to the runway, you'll notice that your nose still will not point in the direction you're going. What you want to do is kind of eyeball the cockpit to see what area of the cockpit is the direction that is straight for the plane. Using track IR is very helpful in this, because you can shift your head around the cockpit to get a good direction on it. Now, everything landing wise is the same as far as flaps and landing gear and your approach. You just will be flying cockeyed. What you want to do is try to land on the side of the runway that the wind is coming from, so you'll have enough time to be able to line yourself up. As you can see, I'm on the left side. Now, as I touch down, I want to start to straighten myself up with the runway, and once I'm on the runway, I can relax a little bit. That's the key to landing in a crosswind, is to, once you have your trim corrected for that wind, you want to try to land on one side of the runway so that you'll have enough time to line yourself up. Landing cockeyed can be dangerous because your front wheels are not made to swivel. In the case of emergency landings, the P-51 is a fairly safe plane. The key to doing a safe crash landing or emergency landing is to manage your speed in the case of an engine failure very carefully, and to look for a very open area, a very safe area to land in. This area down here to my left by these roads looks pretty safe, so I'm going to use it. Now, to kind of simulate serious engine trouble, I'm going to kill the engine and its fuel, and I'm going to give some wacky aileron trim to simulate something going wrong with my controls. Now my speed is just above 200, and I want to be careful to use my gliding to keep up my speed so I don't stall. You also need to remember when gliding that turning also takes away your speed, so you need to do it very carefully as well. Now, you do not want to use landing gear when doing an emergency landing, but you do want to do flaps, so lower your flaps all the way to help give stability. You might want to silence the alarm for pulling your throttle all the way back. Now I'm going to try to use this room as carefully as I can. I'm in a limited space. Like with landing, you want to try to stall just above the surface, just above the ground. Just over that river, and I used a little bit of rudder to keep myself safe there. Alright, in the next DCS tutorial we'll go over air to ground combat for the P-51 Mustang.